On the morning of the 16th of September, 1992, the Bank of England began hemorrhaging reserves to defend a currency peg. One man had bet $10 billion would break. By midnight, George Soros had made £1 billion. Britain was out of the European exchange rate mechanism, and a decade-long political crisis had begun. What made it possible wasn't Soros. It was a trap Britain built for itself. The European exchange rate mechanism was designed as a semi-fixed system, aiming to hold participating currencies within a narrow corridor around a central value. Each country's currency was pegged to the European Currency Unit, ECU, at an agreed central rate. The ERM allowed only limited movement. Currencies could fluctuate by no more than 2.25% above or below this central line. If a currency approached the edge of its band, the rules required its national central bank to intervene immediately. This meant buying or selling its own currency, sometimes in concert with Germany's Bundesbank, to force the rate back toward the center of the band. These interventions weren't optional. They were mandatory, written into the protocol, and triggered automatically when the market price threatened to breach the band. Realignments, the permanent shifting of a currency's central rate, were possible, but only with unanimous agreement from all participating governments. In practice, this rigidity left central banks with little room to maneuver. The ERM structure was built to enforce discipline and stability, but it also meant that when pressure mounted, the only tools available were direct market intervention, and, if that failed, sharp changes to domestic interest rates. The system's logic was clear: defend the band at all costs, or be forced to concede defeat in full view of the world's financial markets. When Britain joined the European exchange rate mechanism in October 1990, the entry rate was fixed at £1 to 2.95 Deutsche Marks. This figure was not drawn from economic fundamentals, but from a political desire to anchor sterling alongside Europe's strongest currency. Cabinet records from September 1990 show Treasury officials warning that the pound was already overvalued. Their models pointed to a real exchange rate at least 5% too high, given Britain's inflation and productivity gap with Germany. The Bank of England's own briefings predicted that defending such a rate would require interest rates above 11%, levels the government itself deemed unsustainable. Margaret Thatcher, recently ousted but still a force in Parliament, voiced her dissent in a House of Commons speech on the 13th of October 1990. She warned that the pound sterling was being set at a level that did not reflect the realities of our economy. She said, "If we are forced to keep the rate artificially high, the inevitable result will be a loss of competitiveness and a painful correction later." Her concerns were echoed in private correspondence to the Chancellor, where she called the European exchange rate mechanism a trap that would force Britain to defend the indefensible. The warnings went unheeded. The government pressed ahead, locking in a parity that would soon become a target for the markets. A currency attack unfolds through a simple yet powerful sequence. First, a fund borrows the target currency, in this case sterling, from a bank or broker. That borrowed sterling is then sold immediately for a stronger currency such as the Deutsche Mark, locking in the current exchange rate. The final step comes later. The fund waits, anticipating that the pound will fall. If the peg breaks and sterling drops, the fund can buy back the same amount of pounds at a cheaper price, repay the original loan, and pocket the difference. This is the essence of short-selling a currency. In 1992, these trades did not happen on a public exchange. The market was over-the-counter, dominated by a handful of major dealer banks in London and New York. Funds used forward contracts, private agreements to sell sterling at a set rate in the future, and currency swaps, which allowed them to exchange large sums for weeks or months at a time. Prime brokers provided leverage as high as 10 to 1, meaning a fund with $1 billion in capital could control $10 billion worth of short positions in sterling. The system's opacity and scale made it possible for a single well-financed fund to exert pressure far beyond its own size, challenging the resources of a national central bank. In this environment, the mechanics of a currency attack were as much about market plumbing and credit as about economic fundamentals. George Soros did not stumble into his position against the pound. Through the Quantum Fund, he assembled a short bet of unprecedented scale, roughly $10 billion, by methodically selling sterling through forwards, swaps, and spot contracts. This was not a gamble on a whim, but a calculated response to a currency that, by every fundamental measure, was mispriced. Britain's recession had deepened, inflation remained stubbornly high, and interest rates hovered above 10% to defend the exchange rate mechanism peg. The government's insistence on holding the pound at 2.95 Deutsche Marks ignored the mounting evidence. The real exchange rate was out of step with economic reality, and the cost of maintaining the peg was rising by the day. Soros's approach was both simple and relentless. He borrowed sterling, sold it for Deutsche Marks and dollars, and waited for the inevitable break. Each new position added weight to the pressure facing the Bank of England, pressure that could not be eased by political statements or temporary interventions. The scale of the operation was staggering for its time. By September 1992, the Quantum Fund's exposure dwarfed that of most central banks, and the market sensed that the government's resources were finite. When the peg finally snapped, Soros's fund closed its trades, realizing a profit of approximately £1 billion in a single day. The story was not just about the size of the bet, but about the cold logic that underpinned it. When political ambition collides with market fundamentals, capital will always seek equilibrium, no matter the cost. On the morning of the 16th of September, 1992, the Bank of England opened its books to a storm. By 8 a.m., sterling was under relentless assault, with billions traded against the pound in London and New York. The government's first response came swiftly. A surprise hike in the base rate from 10 to 12%, announced in the hope of drawing capital back to sterling. The move failed to stem the outflow. Within hours, the bank had spent over £7 billion of its reserves in the foreign exchange markets, buying pounds and selling Deutsche Marks at a pace never seen before. Dealers watched as transaction logs filled with emergency interventions, each one a bet against the tide. At 10:30 a.m., Chancellor Norman Lamont appeared before the press, insisting that the government would do whatever was necessary to defend the currency. His words echoed across television screens, but the markets remained unmoved. By early afternoon, the bank had burned through billions more, pushing total reserve losses to £27 billion. A second desperate rate hike followed at 3 p.m, raising the base rate to 15%. This was the highest level in modern British history, a signal of last resort. Still, the selling continued. As evening fell, the pressure became impossible to hide. At 7 p.m, Prime Minister John Major addressed the nation. The government would no longer maintain sterling within the exchange rate mechanism. In that moment, the peg collapsed. The pound plunged nearly 10% against the Deutsche Mark. The day's final tally was stark: 2 emergency rate hikes, £27 billion in reserves lost, and the public admission of defeat by Britain's highest officials. Black Wednesday had become a matter of record, its consequences irreversible. Britain's formal withdrawal from the European exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, on the 16th of September 1992, brought immediate consequences that rippled through both the economy and the political establishment. The pound, no longer anchored to the Deutsche Mark, fell sharply in the foreign exchange markets. In the months that followed, the Bank of England allowed interest rates to fall from their emergency peak of 15%, dropping to 10% by the end of the year and continuing downward through 1993. Freed from the discipline of the ERM, monetary policy could finally respond to domestic conditions. The result was a marked shift in economic fortunes. Exporters benefited from a weaker pound, manufacturing output rebounded, and GDP growth turned positive by the end of 1992. Inflation, once the central worry, eased as the recession faded and confidence returned to the markets. The political cost for the Conservative Party was immediate and severe. Polling in October 1992 recorded party approval at just 20%, the lowest in decades, as voters registered their anger at the government's failed defence of the currency and the public spectacle of defeat. The image of Chancellor Norman Lamont and Prime Minister John Major conceding the end of the ERM experiment became a symbol of lost credibility. Within months, internal party divisions deepened, and the Conservatives' reputation for economic management, once their strongest asset, was in tatters. The episode haunted the party for years, contributing to its landslide defeat in the 1997 general election. The paradox of Black Wednesday is clear in the data. The economic recovery that followed was stronger and faster than most had predicted, with growth outpacing the rest of Europe by 1994. But the political damage endured, leaving a legacy that would shape British policy and public trust for a generation. Decades on, currency markets remain vulnerable to coordinated speculation. As global finance grows ever more complex, the lesson is unchanged. No policy, however resolute, can defy economic reality indefinitely. In the contest between political will and market logic, fundamentals still write the final chapter. Share your thoughts below.